Madam President, members of the board, pleased to present the FY23 annual appropriations for this school year. Obviously, our appropriations are the budget, if you will, for the fiscal year. We presented the initial budget as a temporary budget back at the June 30th meeting in preparation for the fiscal year, which starts on July 1st. And when we built this budget, I'll get into a little more of a timeline here, but we build it around our strategic plan, which is, together we will ensure a safe learning environment, provide a balanced, high-quality education which maximizes district resources and encourages strong community partnerships. With the goals that really rely on the Treasurer's Office of maintaining and enhanced fiscal stability by focusing our attention and diligence on short and long-term financial planning, which this is the first piece of that. Our annual budget is more of the short term, and then we'll present in November our 5-year forecast, which is updated, which is more of our long-term planning. We have our explore options for alternative revenue to maximize existing personnel, facilities, and resources, and we do that through shared services and our new advertising agreements that we have on our new scoreboard with the help of Dr. Glavin, as well as ensure and continue to balance approach toward an equitable distribution of resources to maximize opportunities across the district. We build our budget on all fiscal decisions should be made in the context of our 5-year forecast, realizing that everything that we do today impacts what we can do tomorrow. We realize that there's management rights attached to every dollar that we spend, and that we should make sure that we spend those dollars on enhancing the learning environment for our students by adding value to teaching and learning. And we need to aggressively manage our largest expense areas, which we know are salaries, benefits, special education, and the facilities that we maintain here on campus. And that we know that quality is always cheaper in the long term, and that we really take that to heart when we do our projects for the district. Just a general timeline for the board. This process actually starts, as you all know, back in January when we approved the adopted tax budget for the next fiscal year, which we have to have to the auditor by January 20th by law. And then prior to February, or right around February, this year was closer to March, we get with our building principals and department chairs, and we start sharing our allocations or having them build their budgets with the zero-based budgeting model at the department level. And we give allocations to our buildings based on our per pupil costs at the elementary, middle school, and high school level. And our administrators begin that process of developing the budget that we're finalizing here tonight. On or before April 15th, we have those budgets turned into my office. That's where I begin to review them with the superintendent and the leadership team to see if we're trending close to our 5-year forecast. We do make sure that our budget for the fiscal year is in line with that 5-year forecast. They aren't separate documents that we only do, 3 times a year basically when we do the update in May as well. We make sure that they're always aligning and adjusting how we do things. Before the end of May, as you know, we approved the May forecast update, which is an update to our November forecast, and we do our appropriations before July 1st. And then on or before September 30th, we're required by law to file our appropriations for the year, which then leads to our, as I said earlier, update of the 5-year forecast that's done in November. If you look at our revenue for the current year, we receive the majority of our revenue from our local tax base. 73.7% comes from the local taxpayer. The other 22% comes from the state and state sources, most of that 15.3% coming from the foundation in the form of the money that we receive for the state for educating our students in restricted and unrestricted funds, and the other approximate 7% coming from the homestead and rollback taxes that we receive as rebates on our returns that we receive, not rebates, returns that we receive on our millage rates that we get from the state that we have. The other 3.5% coming from intermediary sources in the forms of rent, athletic events, fees that we get from selling things, and investments. I'd like to remind the board and the community this is what the state looks like, where 43% of the revenue for the average district in the state of Ohio comes from the state, and 42% is coming from the local government. Ours obviously is different than that. Again, 74% coming from the local taxpayer, because we're considered a wealthy district based on our valuation of our property and the median income of the people that reside in our community. So we receive less state support than the average across the state of Ohio. So it's important for us to make sure that we're protecting those tax dollars and using them to meet our principles and align with our strategic plan. That being said, here's a 5-year trend, excuse me, of where we've been, actuals, 4 years of actuals and 1 year of budget, what we have. We are budgeting $106,351,985, excuse me, for our revenue for the year. Again, $78 million of that coming from our local sources and the other $23 million coming from state sources in the form of aid from the state or property tax reimbursement. You can see we only received $591,000 approximately this year was what we're projecting for federal sources, which is in the form of a Medicaid reimbursement. And then we get $3.7 million in intermediate and other sources. So just a graphical representation of our revenue trend as well as our projected budget for the year. I think the reason why I like to show this graph is, again, it just reiterates where we receive most of our funds from our local taxpayer, but it also shows that our revenue is relatively flat. We don't see a lot of growth in revenue in the district because it's based on property tax. And when we see increases like we did in valuations, for example, like last year, where we saw 18% increases in home valuations, I explained in my previous meetings, really we only see growth on the inside millage of that, so we don't see an 18% increase because of House Bill 920, which reduces the voted millage rate down to a lower effective millage rate. So we see very little growth from a revenue standpoint unless we receive additional funds from our taxpayers in the form of a voted levy, in the form of a general operating, permanent improvement, or emergency. So it's always important when we're looking at our budget to look at two things primarily, because we'll see here in a second why it's important. We look at our enrollment trends over the last 5 years, and these numbers were taken from our enrollment that we look at from our district internally in May, last week, of May. So it's a comparison, those time points are the same, as well as this year's was the first week of September. So you can see that we've seen a steady decline, across enrollment over the last 5 years, which is what our enrollment projections that we had done from 2019 shared. Obviously, we can see in fiscal year 20 through 21 what is known as the COVID drop. This was a trend that was seen across the state in many districts, in many schools, where we saw students who were not coming to school because of COVID, and we expected for that to go back up in 22, but just like many state districts across the state, that didn't happen. So we continue to keep an eye on our enrollment. We're just at about 7,000 kids in seats right now, currently in the district, and we have to take that into account because obviously that affects staffing. Just kind of a breakdown based on grade level bands. If you're into data like I am to kind of see where we're losing students, it seems to be pretty steady across the board. I think the key here is that we see smaller kindergarten numbers than we have been, so we would expect that trend to kind of level off and kind of continue where we're at as we move forward, kind of going into the few years. So I think what we're expecting based on the enrollment analysis that we did, as well as what we're seeing, is we're expecting us to stay right around that 7,000 student range for the district. Looking at our staffing adjustments, because obviously the major cost for us, as we'll see on a future slide, is because of salaries and benefits. So we have to make sure that we're appropriately adjusting our staff to our enrollment trends. You can see that this year we're down 6 staff members in comparison to last year. You can see that back in fiscal year 21 we saw a spike again because of COVID. The decision was made by the board and the superintendent at that time to increase staffing so that we could have smaller class sizes to spread students out. We started to decrease those numbers last year and again this year, and that's something we have to be cognizant of as we continue to move into the future. As we continue to watch our enrollment, is getting our ratios back down to pre-COVID numbers so that we can sustain into the future. The other aspect that I wanted to show, I'm not going to go into this a lot because we've presented this quite a few times to the board and to the community, is that we have our 5-year spending plan for our capital plan, which we fund each year through transfers out of the general fund into our capital improvement budget, our 070 account. And what we did this year is we made the transfer over in 1 year that will cover fiscal years 23, 24, 25, and 26. We made the decision so that way that we had that money in the account where those projects will be funded from, to make sure that we have complete transparency on where our actual cash balance is with regards to those, as we continue to sustain the facility maintenance and upgrades that we're doing through not only the support of the permanent improvement levy, which generates about $1.1 million a year, but also through about a $5 million a year subsidy through this general fund. Also wanted to point out that this year's budget has no assumptions for COVID built into it. You can see last year we spent about $28,670 out of the general fund once we paid for the long-term substitute teachers that we have in the district working on helping students regain the learning loss that happened during COVID. In summer school costs offset by our ESSER 3 funds, and then we had additional costs through the purchase of supplies and other purchase services that we had for COVID. We've assumed those costs for the supplies mainly being in the form of cleaning materials into the budget this fiscal year, and offsetting the additional staff and summer school costs again through ESSER, so it should have no impact on the general fund. So we wanted to share that assumption from the beginning, and you can kind of see at the bottom that we've spent just over $6 million that had a negative impact on our budget because of COVID over the last 4 years. Where does our money go? Our money goes primarily to salary and benefits, which makes sense because we're in a service industry where we provide education to the students of the community, along with the support of the support staff that we need to accomplish those goals in the form of secretaries, custodians, classroom assistants, lunchroom assistants, as well as bus drivers and the like. Our next largest piece of the pie this year is transfers, which I'll get into a little bit more, but typically it's purchase services and then supplies. This year, so what you have again up here is a 4-year look back along with this year's budget, because I think it's important to show trends to the board and to the community, and you can see the year-over-year change on the bottom there percentage-wise, and then you can see that the number that really matters the most is the $126.3 million for this year's budget, which looks like it's a huge increase, or 11.12% increase, that is bigger than last year's budget of $113.7 approximately million. But most of that comes in the form of advances and transfers. $14 million is being transferred this year from the general fund to the capital improvement account to go back and fund those projects, as I said, in fiscal years 23, 24, 25, and 26, because those are projects that the board has voted and approved to move forward with. So to make sure that we have that reflected in our bottom line and our cash balance, we made the decision at my recommendation to make that transfer all at once to the 070 account. And then if the board and the community decide to put an additional permanent improvement levy on, we can move those funds back to the general fund and pay for that out of an increased PI levy. Again, this is something that I look at specifically to kind of, as we prepare our budget, to see if there's anything that's abnormal or doesn't make sense or something that I can't explain. As you can see that the blue and orange lines represent salary and benefits, and you can see that increase over time. And obviously, healthcare costs we cannot control. The increases that are in blue are because of negotiated agreements, and this reflects the 2.75% increase that the board negotiated with both unions and administration and the exempt employees for this current year. And then the biggest difference is that dark blue square at the top, but that goes back to the transfers that I just spoke to. So when I look at this, there's no real inexplicable reason why that we see anything that doesn't cause me any concern, in the sense that I can't explain why we're seeing the trends that we're having. So it's a visual checkpoint for me, as well to the board and the community, to say, okay, can we explain why we see the differences in each of those areas as we go across from left to right? Another way to look at it is to break each respective object out and look at the trends that we see on the respective graphs. You can see the salaries and benefits that are increasing based on the number of employees that we had, as well as our negotiated agreements and increases to the base wage. You look at benefits, and I'm going to come back to that one, and then you can see purchase services is relatively the same from year to year. You can see supplies and materials appears to have an increase right here. And we might go, why are we seeing such an increase in supplies and materials when we haven't seen that before? The reason is because we changed our policy, if you remember back in November of last year, where we changed the threshold for capital assets from 500 to 5,000. So that causes things that used to be in this area to now be coded in this area. So we saw an increase here and a corresponding decrease in our capital outlay. Okay, so for me, that's just another check to go, okay, right, that makes sense. We're going in, everything seems to be kind of going in the right direction. This again is because we started committing years ago to transfer money from the general fund to help pay for the projects that we're doing to maintain and upgrade the facilities. So we can explain this. And this one, I just want to remind everybody, because it's important when we look at some of the later slides, is in 2021, the last month of the fiscal year, we had a premium holiday because of the built-up reserve that we had in our insurance fund. So this actually dropped because there was only 11 months of 12 months being collected. In 2022, again, it looks like it remained relatively flat because we had 2 months of partial premium holidays. So we collected 10 full months and 2 partial months. So we don't see the increase. So it just makes this increase look more exaggerated than it really is, because we're expecting 12 full months of collection. So that's something just to note and be able to explain, because I think it's important to explain to the board and the community when we see these variances. So when we look at salaries and benefits year over year, when you break things out, we're projecting a 4.6% increase based on the negotiated agreements from last year to this year. We're seeing a corresponding increase in purchase services of about 10.76%, which is just a little bit over $1 million. We see an increase in supplies and materials of about 13%, but we're seeing a decrease in capital outlay of minus 50%, because this is going to be the first full fiscal year where our new policy change comes into place. So again, we're going to see higher than continued expected supplies and materials and lower capital outlay. So when we look at our budget, and these were the numbers that I shared with you originally, but we back out any of the transfers that we made to the reserve or the 5-year capital plan, I think it's important to look at that trend as well, because it kind of normalizes everything. And you can see that last year, if you look at what we spent in fiscal year 21 to what we actually ended up spending less the transfers, we actually spent less than the year before. So when you look at actual expenditures, not you take those transfers out, we spent less. So we had flat expense growth. We're expecting a 4.57% growth based on the assumptions that we've made at the beginning of the year. I would assume that we're going to be better than that. You know, if we even spend $1 million less, that's going to show improvement there. And, you know, we're going to continue to monitor our budget, as I do every month, where I'll share where we're trending versus our forecast to continue to do that. And my expectation is that we're going to try to be less than that. We won't be more, and our goal is to always be less. But as we presented this to the Citizens Financial Advisory, they always challenge me to be as close as I possibly can, both on revenue and expenses. So based on the analytic software that we're using and the assumptions that we're making, I think we are going to be relatively close on the revenue. Expenses are a little bit harder to fluctuate because, you know, for example, you don't see things that happen with like gas last year. We didn't expect gas to drastically jump like it did in the middle of the year. Those are things that we can't control. But we can control some of our purchases, so we'll continue to do that. So I share this slide because obviously I've talked a lot about transfers with the board and the community, and it really goes back to the fact that we have a permanent improvement levy that was voted in 1988. It collected just over $1 million. If you were to take that out, that 1 mil now is actually below, I think it's like 0.38 effective mils. So through inflation, or if you were to look at it from what it would actually collect today at 1 mil, it's like $2.2 million. So it's the buying power has been lost, right? We haven't asked for additional permanent improvement money since 1988. So it's like if you were living at your house and your wages stayed the exact same since 1988, obviously you could do less with that unless you had another revenue source. Our other revenue source of late has been the general fund. You may ask, because you're inquisitive like me and you love my presentations and you know where I'm going with this, geez, Mr. Wade, what do we typically spend out of the general fund to help maintain our facilities? And I say, well, I knew you were going to ask that question. We spend on average about $5.2 million a year once you back out what we currently collect. Or so we're spending about $6.2 million a year to maintain our facilities and make upgrades. So that means roofs, pavement, window projects, some of the upgrades that we're making to the stadium, maintaining our sports facilities, science labs that we have on the docket, other renovations that we know we're going to need to be able to do. And as I've shared with the board and the community before, I like to fact check things, right? So we look at what's the trend, what's the research show us? And I use the Carnegie Mellon white paper quite a bit, and I talk about how the fact that it's about 2% or 2.25% where you're at with regards to your total insured value or total value of your plant, and ours is roughly $250 million. Just to make simple math, 2% of $250 million is $5 million. Is about what you should be spending to maintain. And that doesn't include enhancing. That's just maintaining your facilities. So if you look at it, we're spending on average about $6 because we are doing improvements at the same time. We only collect $1 million, but at the same time, the reason why I point this out is that we're spending out of the general fund $31.1 million that could be spent out of a permanent improvement levy, and this is where I could get into the educational piece. A PI levy can only be spent on buses, bricks, balls, books. There's specific things that it can be spent on. It can only be spent on things that have a useful life of 5 years. It cannot be spent on salaries and benefits. General operating dollars can be spent on anything, but typically they're spent on what we're here to do, which is educating our students. So really what we're doing, because we don't have a PI levy that funds the needs of the district, is we're spending $31 million of our general operating fund over the next 5 years on permanent improvement levies. So this kind of creates a problem, right? We can see that we're spending down our general fund quicker than it needs to be spent down. We have fixed revenue and increasing costs. We're deficit spending. So we know how that works in the state of Ohio. That means we're going to have to get additional revenue to just maintain what we have. There's ways that we can do it, though, right? We can make the decision to increase our PI levy, which directly tells the community that we're going to spend that money on the projects that we had listed back here somewhere. Thought I must have skipped it. I've screwed up here. There we go. Because we know we need to spend our money on technology. We know that we have furniture upgrades that we need. We know that we have buses, and we know we have vehicles that we need to replace. And we know that we have the enhancements in the funding needs of improvements that we have to do. And the community could say, we want you to spend X amount of dollars on those projects. And then what that allows us to do is reduce those expenses that are being taken out of the general fund for all these items. It puts that money really back in the general fund. So that reduces how much we're deficit spending each year and fixes those costs to a specific fund. So as we shared with the Citizens Financial Committee, that does two things. It allows us to push off the need for a general operating levy if we were able to increase our PI levy, which obviously is an increase in a levy. That would be a tax increase because we'd have to go from whatever millage rate that we have now to probably about 2.25 to 2.25 per mills, which roughly costs, I think for a $100,000 home, is just under $6 per month. That allows us to push off the need for general operating dollars, and it also allows us to ask for less general operating dollars from our taxpayers because we would be removing all of these expenses. So we'd be spending money out of a specific pot for specific projects and then keeping the general fund dollars where they belong, focused on the day-to-day operation of the district and the instruction and learning of our students and the costs associated with that. Because at some point, we're going to have to ask for additional revenue. It's just how do we decide to do it as a community, a board, to do that? Because, well, we could always make the decision too, right, not to. And that results in our facilities not being maintained, which is going to go against our principle of it's cheaper in the long run to buy quality, because we're going to have more expense in the long run to catch up, and then we just get behind it. Or we can make the decision to not have some of the programs that we have, cut some of the staff, and I'm not suggesting that. I think those are worst case scenarios. Those aren't things that we should be thinking about. But as we think about the big picture and think about moving forward, this year's appropriations brings to light the fact that we need to have these discussions. And hence the reason why the Citizens Financial Advisory Committee approved the budget with the recommendation that we have these discussions with the board. And I shared with the board in our Friday update that we should have those discussions towards the end of October, because we have a timeline of a renewal levy that we have to pass before the end of calendar year 24 for the expiring emergency levy that comes off after 10 years. So we need to pass that, as well as look at other funding sources to maintain the trajectory that we're on, while also at the same time being prudent and tightening our belts and sharpening our pencils and doing that. And we did that through negotiations with the healthcare changes that we made, and we continue to do that with making sure that we question every dollar that we spend. So when we look at a summary of kind of where we're at from a budget reserve, we do have a 5% policy balance that we are supposed to look at along with a set aside. The board, when revenue was exceeding expenses, was able to put away $5.2 million. So we have that set aside. That's not included in our current cash balance. If we look at kind of where we've been and where we're at, the last time we deficit spend before fiscal year 21 was back in fiscal year 15. That's when we went out in 16 and actually passed the new money operating levy when Mr. Miller was here, which has gotten us through this point. We're projected this year to deficit spend by almost $20 million. It is a large number. It seems larger than you see on the other pages, but what this will also happen is in the out years, the $4 to $5 million that we were going to transfer out from the general fund to the capital improvement won't happen. So those expenses will be reduced in the out years. So we're kind of just lumped them all into 1 year. That being said, if everything goes as projected, we're expecting to have $34 million or almost $35 million in the bank after our $11.7 million set aside, because the district has a policy that we should be not going below the 5% reserve plus an additional 10% of the prior year's expenses, because of the fact that wouldn't be fiscally responsible. So that puts us at $16 million set aside that is not accounted for in this $34.9 million. Happy to answer any questions about the appropriations.
Mr. Wade, I had a question. The ratio for the teacher to student, because of the decrease over the last couple of years, have we had better ratios with the teacher-student ratios for the classrooms?
Yeah, we've seen two things happen during that time. We saw a decrease in enrollment and an increase in staff because of COVID. So the ratios have dropped in the last 3 years, or prior 2 years. So fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, they were lower than we had seen historically before that happened. We are continuing to right-size that, so to speak, with regards to bringing the staff ratios back down to pre-COVID numbers, but they're still lower than they were pre-COVID currently right now.
And do we know what the student-teacher ratio is within the classrooms in general, or?
I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay.
I could get that into a Friday update for you, though.
Okay, cool. Thank you.